All right. Thanks so much for that, Arun. I'm also going to be talking about changes over time, but of a different form. Of course, I'm Sam Trejo here at Princeton University. The title of my talk today is DNA Reveals the Growing Ancestral Diversity of the United States. I just wanted to flag up front, this is joint work with Marissa Thompson, who's an assistant professor in the sociology department at Columbia University. And it builds off work with Luyan Zhang, who is a PhD student here in OPR. Luyan and I have been collaborating for a couple of years now. Okay, so the context that we're in is that now over 1 in 5 Americans has taken a genetic ancestry test. So these are things offered by companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com. You can see an example of what 23andMe provides in the top left here. But basically, they provide estimates of the proportions of a person's genome, their DNA, that falls into various geographic categories. I'm actually not going to use the term genetic ancestry that much in this talk. Some academics are arguing that this term, that calling the information that's provided by genetic ancestry tests, genetic ancestry, is actually somewhat of a misnomer. And I think they have some good points. So I'm going to use the term genetic similarity and refer to these as genetic similarity proportions. Okay, so there's actually been a lot of demographic and sociological research on, a few different things. One, the conceptual distinction between race and ancestry. What is race, what is ancestry, and how are they conflated sometimes in research and everyday life? And then also there's been a lot of research on how people interpret information from genetic ancestry tests, right? What they make of them. Lay people who don't necessarily have a sort of a technical understanding of the processes that generated them. And I've actually taken part in both of these sort of research domains. But I want to do something different today because very few social scientists have actually constructed these measures and utilized genetic similarity proportions in their research. And I actually think this is an oversight because these measures can bring novel insights to our research. And today I'm going to show you, but they can help provide a fixed point from which to view social changes, and in particular regarding the social construction of race. Okay, so what are some of these nice properties of genetic similarity proportions? First off, like all, like a person's genome, they're fixed at birth. This is, in opposition to a person's racial identity or especially their classification by others, which can change across place and time. Genetic similarity proportions are transmitted from one generation to the next without bias. That is to say, parents pass on a representative portion of their DNA to their children, at least in expectation. And this isn't true with racial ethnic identity, right? Especially among Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, there's an imperfect intergenerational transmission. There's also a lot of within-group variation of these genetic similarity proportions, particularly among Black Americans and Hispanic Americans in the US. And finally, they're measured with very little error. And this is different than other within-group heterogeneity measures like, say, skin tone. So these genetic similarity proportions have a lot of useful properties. And I'm going to look at sort of average changes over time today. Okay, so how do we construct these genetic similarity proportions? We use supervised admixture models. And for the sake of the presentation, I'm largely going to skip over the details here. If you want a working paper of me and Luyan, please just send us an email. But I think the thing to take away is that these measures really closely correspond to the continental information provided by GATS, genetic ancestry tests. So you can think of this as there's the way that we've generated these. There's 5 different proportions corresponding to kind of 5 broad reference populations. We have a sub-Saharan African reference population in yellow here, the European ancestry or genetic similarity reference population here in blue, East Asian in green, Indigenous American in kind of a light, like a salmon almost, and then Middle Eastern ancestry in this purple. I'm going to try to keep these colors relatively consistent throughout the talk. So it's a lot of different proportions to kind of think about. We're actually going to narrow it down at some point. But the key thing to think is that once we have results from our model, for every individual in our data who we have genotype data for, they're going to have 5 estimated proportions that sum to 1. Okay, so what are we actually going to do? What data are we going to estimate these proportions in? We're going to use 2 genotyped national representative longitudinal studies. The first is the health and retirement study. We've sliced the data such that the birth year is on average about 1945. And then we're also going to use the ad health data, which is a little more than a generation later, with an average birth year of about 1980. So we're going to restrict to just US-born respondents. So we're really trying to understand the changes in these genetic similarity proportions over time among US-born Americans. We're going to utilize the survey weights to kind of grant a national representative interpretation. And we're going to use inverse probability weighting to adjust for selection into genotyping. So most of the people in these studies were genotyped, but not all. And we're also going to use data on self-reported race and ethnicity. We're a little bit limited here because HRS is a pretty coarse measure. So for what I'm showing you today, we're going to use Hispanic, non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, and non-Hispanic other. Okay, so the first question is, how have the average genetic similarity profiles of the US changed over time? And we'll begin with the 1945 birth cohort. This is derived from HRS. And we can see that, the 76% European genetic similarity, 11% Middle Eastern genetic similarity, 10% Sub-Saharan African genetic similarity, 2% Indigenous American, and then finally 1% East Asian. So for the first simple thing we can do is just compare this to the 1980 birth cohort. And we see some changes here that are pretty obvious. I'm going to summarize them for you here, which is basically a decrease in European genetic similarity, and then an increase in African, Indigenous American, and East Asian genetic similarity. Middle Eastern genetic similarity largely remains the same. The reason that there's actually such a high percentage for this is that most of this is coming from, self-identified Southern Europeans, so people from like Italy or Spain. So it's present both in kind of white Americans and Hispanic Americans. Okay, so because it's a 12-minute talk, we're not going to get into the weeds on this one, but I just wanted to show you. I actually am able to sort of match ad health to, data from the ACS on the 2015 birth cohort, so another 35 years later. And I'm treating basically the ad health people as the parents. And from the parents' generation, you can kind of, estimate the child generation. So we actually have the numbers for 2015. And basically just the same trend continues here, right? The same ones that increased before continue to increase, and the same ones that decreased before continue to decrease. But we're going to focus for this talk on just these kind of more simply derived estimates. And we're actually going to zoom in on just a few because we don't have enough time to get into all of them. So in particular, we're going to explore the changes in European genetic similarity, Sub-Saharan African genetic similarity, and Indigenous American genetic similarity. The first thing we're going to do is just ask, are these changes kind of moving with underlying demographic changes, racial and ethnic demographics in particular? So we're going to use a Kitagawa decomposition to decompose the change in this proportion over time into the expected change given the shifts in racial ethnic demographics, and then like a residual term, which really refers to kind of within group change. So, changes in the average genetic similarity proportions of Hispanic Americans, changes in the average genetic similarity proportions of white Americans, for example. Okay. So here, before I was showing you percentage points, now we're switching into sort of percent change, right? So Sub-Saharan African genetic similarity moved from about 11 percentage points to a little over 14 percentage points. It's like a 35% change-ish. So that's what we're showing here. And basically, we're going to do the Kitagawa decomposition, and I'll show you the results. So this gray bar is what we would have expected simply based off of demographic change. So we actually would have expected, from the demographic change of 1945 to 1980, a larger increase in Sub-Saharan African genetic similarity. But there was a very small offsetting within group change that sort of made it a little bit smaller in actuality. We see a similar pattern among the sort of European genetic similarity proportion. We would have expected a larger decrease in percent change, but there was this, small within group changes that offset it. And then we have a really kind of exacerbated version of this for the Indigenous American genetic similarity proportion, where we would have, in actuality, we observe a little bit over a 50% increase, but we would have expected over twice that. But there was this very large offsetting change of within group changes in genetic similarity. So the rest of the talk is going to be sort of exploring some of these patterns. So racial ethnic demographic changes largely explained. Sort of the changes in European genetic similarity in the increase, that's a decrease, and then the increase in the average African genetic similarity. But they kind of poorly predict this relatively modest increase in average Indigenous American genetic similarity. So why is this? One thing that we can do is just look at the distributions of these genetic similarity proportions within race over time. And so here we're showing just a histogram of the health and retirement study Black Americans, and this is their sort of African genetic similarity. And we can see, a skewed distribution that's centered a little bit above 0.8. And now we can just add in the add health data and see what changed. And what we see here is that there's a slight leftward shift, relatively small, and this really interesting kind of bump around 0.4 to 0.5, which is kind of very likely the result of new Black, non-Black interracial marriage. So we see a relatively small shift in the distribution that's nonetheless interesting. But among Hispanic Americans, we see something really different. Now we're looking at the sort of Indigenous American genetic similarity. And we see kind of a bell-ish shaped curve centered around 0.4. This is in the earlier birth cohort, but in this later birth cohort, we see this really big change. We see basically, a leftward shift of over 10 percentage points on average, and a large increase in the number of self-identified Hispanic Americans who have very little or no, Indigenous American genetic similarity. And so this is going to be part of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. We're seeing sort of shifts in the distributions within group, but we're also seeing like shifts in the relationship, in some cases, of one's genetic similarity proportions and one's racial or ethnic identity. So this is a case for Black Americans. On the x-axis, we have African genetic similarity. The y-axis is probability of identifying as Black. And here we have basically the two curves representing kind of add health and HRS. And the key thing is that there's this kind of strong monotonic relationship, but it's relatively constant across time. But with Hispanic Americans, we see something quite different, actually, where there's a leftward shift of this blue curve relative to this red curve. And I should say now we're using sort of Indigenous American genetic similarity here on the x-axis. And so there's actually people who are across time who had very similar genetic similarity profiles, but are identifying differently. And in particular, people with less Indigenous American ancestry are more likely to identify as Hispanic now. So just to wrap it all up, we can use these measures of genetic similarity to capture demographic changes that are missed by categorical data. And the US has become increasingly diverse, even within racial ethnic groups, and kind of we're terming this ancestral diffusion. And in some cases, we see changes in these racial ethnic boundaries or evidence for that. And so though race is kind of often used to reify biologically essentialist notions, DNA is often used to reify biologically essentialist notions of race, it can also be used to highlight the social construction of race, and particularly the reconstruction across place and time. And that is it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm not trained as a demographer, but as I continue my research projects and agenda, demographic questions increasingly become part of my repertoire. As someone who studies global LGBT policy transformations, I'm now increasingly curious, what are these policy effects on queer populations, particularly queer migrants? And so with that, we're going to dive right in. So one thing that's been happening in the United States over the last 15 years or 17 years or so is that rates of immigrants and same-sex couples have been increasing quite rapidly. That's the figure on the right, relative to immigrants and different sex couples. So over this time span between 2008 to 2019, different sex couples increased by 13%, and immigrants and same-sex couples increased by roughly 75%. And so there's this burgeoning population within the United States. And so there's been growing research trying to understand who queer migrants are. And there's typically four type of characteristics or four type of studies that people will focus on, sort of motivations for migrating, how is being a gender or sexual minority in your home country sort of motivate your migration decisions. Another set of literature are largely focused on asylum and refugees, which looks at really state disciplining of gender and sexuality. How does needing to get refugee status or claim asylum in the United States, or even apply for a spousal visa, force you inadvertently in this process look more of an American queer person based on trying to get judgment from the state. The third looks at quality of life experiences and changing subjectivities, like how does migration actually change one's sexuality and change one's gender identity? And the last one looks at social remittances and social change. Basically, how does, when coming to the United States, send progressive ideas or more liberal ideas about gender and sexuality actually back to the home country? So one thing that's emerging from this new scholarship, trying to understand this new population, is that there's an emergent narrative or theme that has come about, which is that queer migrants are largely seeking refuge in the United States, and they often have a liberatory narrative in them, that they're fleeing repression or conservative origin countries and familial conditions, and operating on the margins of society. But the evidentiary bases of these studies have largely been small and qualitative studies. And so, which are very important and have allowed us to understand a lot about queer migrants, but it doesn't necessarily allow us to ask the question of who are queer migrants at the population level. And that's what I'm going to be focused on a little bit for today. And so, of course, the actual data to look at queer migrants at the population level don't necessarily exist, but through the American Community Survey, we can look at one slice of this population, and that is immigrants living in same-sex households. And so this necessarily excludes single queer migrants. It doesn't look at cohabitating or non-cohabitating individuals. It doesn't look at trans individuals, but at least it gives us some sort of data to look at one segment of this queer population across the United States and over time. And so one of the things that this first paper that my co-author, I should mention, this is done with Nathan Hoffman, is a graduate student at UCLA. And so a first paper that we have just looks at some very, very basic descriptives of this population, which is compared to immigrants in different sex couples, so compared to their heterosexual counterparts. What are just some quick descriptives of immigrants and same-sex couples? So we can see that despite sort of a little bit of the narrative of these are people on the margins of society, this population actually has high rates of college completion, high rates of high school completion, have higher annual incomes, and actually have higher socioeconomic statuses as well, relatively compared to their immigrants in different sex couples. And if we shift up to the country level, what we can see is that these immigrants are usually coming from countries that have fewer immigrants already in the United States. They're come from relatively richer countries compared to their heterosexual counterparts, and coming from more democratic countries as well. So it's not necessarily fleeing repression, but actually coming from pretty well-off countries. And if we look at this globally, this is just an average between 2008 and 2019, and this is the percent of same-sex couples out of all immigrant couples in within the ACS from the United States. And so it's a large population or concentration of people coming from Western Europe, Scandinavia, and of course, Latin America, which actually has fairly progressive LGBTQ policies. And so the story that we tend to find when it emerge this narrative of queer migrants fleeing repression at the margins of society isn't necessarily bearing out when we look at this population more quantitatively. And so one of the things that a second question or a second paper in Social Forces that we ask is like, what explains this rise in same-sex couples in the immigrant same-sex couples in the United States? Well, one thing that happened that was really important in 2013 is that the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the Defense of Marriage Act, which allowed U.S. citizens to apply for a spousal and fiancé visa for their same-sex partner for the very first time. And so we had this question, did that cause increases of mixed status couples in the United States? Because you can see mixed status couples are actually the ones that are increasing more quickly relative to couples that are both two immigrant same-sex couples. And so what we find, I'll explain this really quickly, on the left-hand side, we indeed find this intervention that when the Defense of Marriage Act was ruled unconstitutional, we see this increase in mixed status same-sex couples into the United States. The scores don't necessarily quite matter for today's presentation, but what this does is stratifies countries based upon the policy environment in the country of origin. And what this shows is that this effect is only for individuals coming from countries that have fairly progressive LGBTQ policies already. So which in particular is marriage equality, civil unions, and joint parental adoption rights. And so individuals coming from countries with more repressive policies see no effect whatsoever. So this growth caused by the overturning of the Defense of Marriage Act is really in bringing in more of these privileged migrants into the United States. And so quick summary of this is like the country level characteristics of higher GDP, more democratic, lower immigrant stock, and then also coming from more progressive LGBTQ policy environments, especially those that have marriage equality and joint adoption rights. At the individual level, they have higher levels of educational attainment, incomes, and occupational prestige. And then one driver of this expansion is the overturning of the Defense of Marriage Act in 2013. So that gets to this current project. So this current project I'm going to talk about just quite briefly is for a special issue at it's been accepted at the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies under the topic of same-sex marriage and migration. And so for this paper, what my co-author and I are looking at is the geographic distribution of immigrants and same-sex couples across the United States over this time period. And so specifically what we're comparing is how does the geographic distribution of immigrants and same-sex couples compare to immigrants and different sex couples, so their heterosexual immigrant counterparts, as opposed to US-born same-sex couples. So gay, because of all of this terms of saying same-sex couples all the time, you can be like immigrant heterosexuals, immigrant gays, American gays, just to like make, I know it's not the best language, but just to make it make sense in our head as we move along. Because one of the things that's happening is I mentioned that most of this influx is through mixed status couples. So if it's an immigrant in a relationship with a US citizen, does that make them behave more similarly as an American, make them more integrated into American LGBTQ life, for example? Or does their immigrant status stay more salient and they actually end up still operating more akin to their immigrant counterparts? Is the central premise of this paper. And so to do that, what we do is basically we use the American Community Survey and just create counts. This is just a descriptive paper. So we're just kind of just looking at various correlations amongst these three groups. And so it's just a number of immigrants and same-sex couples, US-born individuals and same-sex couples, and immigrants and different sex couples. And the counts of each category located, and we're using the geographic space is public use micro data areas or PUMAs. So we want to try to capture something smaller than an MSA, but if people have suggestions on how to do this better, I definitely would like that feedback. And so we use quasi-Poisson models to just predict the counts of each subcategory. We have state and year fixed effects, and we just look at various predictors known to predict both migrant settlement and then US-born LGBTQ people settlement, and to kind of see basically where and compare the effects of who are LGBTQ or who are immigrants and sex couples more similar to. And so we're just I'm only gonna highlight, there's a little bit more effects, and we're gonna highlight ones that were most distinct across these three categories. So starting with socioeconomic, what we can see is that immigrants and same-sex couples and US-born gays live in PUMAs that are more highly educated compared to heterosexual immigrants or immigrants in heterosexual relationships. And interestingly, immigrants and same-sex couples seem to be unaffected by rent prices, while for the other two categories, as rent increases, the counts of these immigrants decrease. Next, looking at, so they tend to be in a little bit more of areas that have perhaps higher socioeconomic statuses. Next, looking at sort of racial nativity diversity, one thing we can see is that immigrants and same-sex couples live in areas that have higher percentage of Black people living in them, and the other two have no effect. They live in areas that are more Hispanic compared to the other two groups. And then they also live in areas that are with a lot of immigrants, but heterosexual people live in places with a higher percentage of immigrants. And then finally, looking at political like contextual factors, one of the things that we find is that immigrants and same-sex couples actually live in states with the most progressive LGBTQ rights, which is actually even compared to US gay Americans. And that makes sense given the prior work showing that these immigrants are largely coming from progressive countries. You can imagine that perhaps they're selecting into states that already have like a similar type of rights as their country of origin and don't necessarily want to move to a place where they're going sort of down on this policy or like rights index. The one last thing I just wanted to highlight is that we're looking at sort of like contextual effects, which is basically access to goods and services that cater to these two types of communities. So one way of looking at goods and services that cater to these different types of communities is looking at perhaps accounts or presence of nonprofit organizations. And so one of the things that's interesting is that immigrants and same-sex couples have no association whatsoever when it comes to immigrant serving nonprofits, that more immigrant serving nonprofits have no association whatsoever, but it does have an association with heterosexual immigrants. But immigrants and same-sex couples do have a higher association with LGBTQ nonprofits, behaving a little bit more like their US counterpart. So one of the things, just to summarize in terms of this category on the left really quickly, is just that immigrants and same-sex couples tend to live in Pumas that are more diverse in racial nativity composition, higher rents perhaps. I didn't show density, but it's also more dense areas, more progressive state policies, more LGBTQ nonprofits. And so one of the things we've done so far is looked at what Pumas are these, and one of the ways in which we're finding, and this is curious to get people's feedback, is basically these are like early gentrifying areas. There's a lot of research that shows that LGBTQ people can often be early gentrifiers into a community. And one thing that's showing that this population in particular is located in early gentrifying parts of cities. And so we're curious about the implication of this as an unexpected source of gentrification in the United States. But with that, I'd like to thank you and offer questions and feedback. So thank you.